In just 7 years, from 1845 to 1852, Ireland lost 1/4 of its population to death and emigration. 1 million starved. Another million fled. The population has never recovered, making Ireland the only country in Europe with fewer people today than in 1840. But this demographic catastrophe was just the most visible wound in 10,000 years of invasion, conquest, and systematic cultural destruction. This small island endured Viking raids, Norman conquest, Tudor plantations, Cromwellian genocide that killed 40% of the population, centuries of legal oppression, and a partition that tore it in two. Yet Irish culture, language, and identity survived when countless other conquered peoples vanished from history. How does a nation lose half its people yet preserve its soul? Join me as we trace Ireland's complete story from Stone Age monuments older than the pyramids to the peace that finally came in 1998. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age released its frozen grip on northern Europe, a wild and untouched island emerged from beneath retreating glaciers. This was Ireland, a land of dense forests, rushing rivers, and coastlines teeming with life. But it was empty of people. How long would it remain that way? Around 8,000 BCE, the first human beings set foot on Irish soil. These were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, small bands of families who had tracked the receding ice sheets northward from continental Europe. But how did they reach an island? At this time, sea levels were still lower than today, and narrow land bridges periodically connected Ireland to Britain. Others arrived by sea, navigating primitive boats along coastal routes, following seals and seabirds that promised abundant hunting grounds ahead. The earliest evidence of these pioneers comes from Mount Sandel in County Derry, perched on a bluff overlooking the River Bann. Here, archaeologists uncovered the remains of Ireland's oldest known settlement, dating back to around 7,600 BCE. What did they find? Circular huts measuring roughly 6 meters across, their floors littered with thousands of stone tools, burnt hazelnut shells, and the bones of wild pigs, fish, and birds. This wasn't just a temporary camp. These people returned here season after season, generation after generation. These Mesolithic Irish lived in harmony with their environment's rhythms. In spring and summer, they fished the rivers for salmon and eels, their sophisticated stone tools capable of crafting wooden fish traps and spears. Autumn brought hazelnuts, a crucial food source that could be stored for winter months. They hunted wild boar in the thick oak forests that blanketed the island and gathered berries, roots, and edible plants whose names we'll never know. Along the coasts, they collected shellfish, their empty shells forming massive middens that still exist today, silent testimony to countless meals eaten over thousands of years. Their population remained small, perhaps never exceeding several thousand people scattered across the entire island. They left no grand monuments, no written records, no pottery. Yet they possessed intimate knowledge of their world that we can barely imagine. They knew which plants healed and which poisoned, when the salmon ran, where the boar wallowed, and how to read weather in the flight of birds. For 4,000 years, this way of life continued largely unchanged. The Mesolithic Irish moved with the seasons, following food sources, living lightly on the land. But around 4000 BCE, everything was about to change. Across the sea, a revolutionary new way of life was spreading northward, one that would transform Ireland forever. Across the Irish Sea, a revolution was underway. In the fertile river valleys of the Near East, humans had discovered something extraordinary. They could control their food supply. They could plant seeds, harvest grain, domesticate animals, and stay in one place. This Neolithic revolution had been spreading slowly across Europe for millennia, and around 4000 BCE, it finally reached Ireland's shores. The new arrivals brought with them wheat and barley seeds, sheep and cattle, polished stone axes, and most importantly, a completely different understanding of the land. Where Mesolithic hunters had moved with the seasons, these Neolithic farmers cleared forests, built permanent homes, and divided the landscape into fields. The transformation was dramatic. Using their polished stone axes, they felled Ireland's ancient oak forests, burned the timber, and planted crops in the ashen-rich soil. In North County Mayo, these early farmers created something astonishing. The Seaid fields, hidden beneath blankets of bog for millennia until their recent discovery, reveal an organized Stone Age landscape covering 12 square kilometers. Stone walls divide the terrain into rectangular fields, each designed for grazing cattle or growing crops. This wasn't primitive subsistence farming. This was planned agriculture on a massive scale, evidence of a sophisticated society that thought in generations. But the Neolithic people built something far more mysterious than field walls. Around 3200 BCE, they constructed Newgrange, a monument that still stands today on a bend of the River Boyne. This wasn't simply a tomb. Requiring an estimated 300 workers 20 years to complete, Newgrange is older than Stonehenge, older than the Egyptian pyramids. 200,000 tons of stone, some transported from over 70 kilometers away, were shaped into a massive circular mound 90 meters across. Inside, a precisely engineered passage leads to a cross-shaped chamber. And here's where the real genius appears. On the winter solstice, and only on that single morning, sunlight penetrates through a specially designed roof box, illuminating the passage and flooding the inner chamber with golden light. How did Bronze Age farmers possess the astronomical knowledge and engineering skill to create such precision? Newgrange wasn't alone. Noath and Douth, nearby passage tombs of similar grandeur, form a ceremonial landscape that dominated the Boyne Valley. These monuments tell us something profound. Neolithic Ireland had achieved surplus. They had enough food, enough stability, and enough social organization to dedicate massive resources to honoring their dead. Around 2400 BCE, Ireland entered the Bronze Age. Metalworkers discovered how to combine copper and tin, creating bronze tools and weapons far superior to stone. But Ireland's Bronze Age craftsmen became famous for something else entirely. Irish gold lunulae, crescents worn around the neck, have been found across Europe. Irish copper mined at Ross Island and Mount Gabriel was exported through extensive trade networks connecting Ireland to Britain, France, and beyond. The island was no longer isolated. It was part of a Bronze Age world. Around 500 BCE, a new cultural force swept across Ireland, though whether it arrived with invading armies or simply through the gradual spread of ideas remains one of history's most debated questions. The Celts had come to dominate much of Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the plains of Anatolia, and their influence now transformed Ireland into Gaelic Ire. Unlike the Roman invasions that would reshape Britain, no massive Celtic army conquered Ireland in a single campaign. Instead, Celtic language, customs, and technology seem to have permeated the island gradually, mixing with existing Bronze Age populations. What emerged was distinctly Irish, a Gaelic culture that would prove remarkably resilient for the next 2,000 years. The Celts brought iron, a metal that revolutionized warfare and agriculture. Iron plows could break heavy soil that stone and bronze never could. Iron swords and spears gave warriors unprecedented killing power. But more transformative than their metalwork was their social structure. Ireland became organized into roughly 150 tuatha, small kingdoms rarely larger than a modern county, each ruled by a rí, or king. These kingdoms existed in a complex hierarchy. A rí tuath ruled his small territory, but above him stood the rí ruairesh, king of several kingdoms. And in theory, though rarely in practice, a rí ruaireach might acknowledge an even higher power. The Ard Rí, the High King of Ireland, who supposedly ruled from the Hill of Tara in County Meath. Celtic Ireland had no cities, no towns, no central government. Power was utterly decentralized, a political fragmentation that would have profound consequences when foreign invaders eventually arrived. Each tuath maintained its own laws, its own army, and its own fierce independence. Raiding cattle from neighboring kingdoms wasn't just common, it was expected, a way for young warriors to prove their courage and kings to demonstrate their strength. The Druids held a special place in this warrior society. These learned men, taking up to 20 years to complete their training, served as judges, poets, historians, and priests. They memorized vast quantities of law, genealogy, and sacred knowledge, passing it orally from generation to generation. The Druids never wrote down their most important teachings, believing that committing knowledge to written form weakened the mind's power to retain it. Yet, writing did exist. The Ogham script, with its unique alphabet of lines carved along the edges of standing stones, marked boundaries and commemorated the dead. These cryptic inscriptions, reading vertically rather than horizontally, represent Europe's earliest written Irish language. Celtic religion centered on sacred groves, springs, and liminal spaces where the mortal world touched the supernatural. At Samhain, the festival marking summer's end, the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin. Human sacrifice, though its extent remains controversial, appears to have been practiced at crucial moments, offerings to gods whose names we barely remember: Luch, Brigid, the Dagda, and the fearsome Morrigan. The Latin artistic style flourished in Ireland long after it had vanished from continental Europe. Metalworkers created intricate spiral patterns on bronze mirrors, shields, and horse equipment. These weren't mere decorations. They were expressions of a worldview that saw all existence as interconnected, spiraling cycles without beginning or end. By 400 CE, as the Roman Empire crumbled across the Channel, Celtic Ireland stood independent and isolated, its warrior culture intact, its language thriving, its druids still teaching in sacred groves. But sailing across those very waters, a new force was approaching, one that would challenge everything the druids held sacred. Christianity was coming to Ireland. The man who would transform Ireland arrived not as a conqueror with armies, but as a former slave returning to the land of his captivity. Patrick, a Romano-British youth kidnapped by Irish raiders around 410, had spent 6 years tending sheep on the slopes of Slemish Mountain in County Antrim. After escaping back to Britain, he experienced visions calling him to return, and in 432, Patrick came back to Ireland as a bishop, beginning a mission that would reshape the island's soul. Patrick's genius lay in adaptation rather than destruction. Unlike missionaries elsewhere who demanded converts abandon their entire culture, Patrick wove Christianity into existing Irish traditions. Sacred wells became Christian pilgrimage sites. The Druids' sacred fire festivals transformed into Christian feast days. The Celtic love of intricate metalwork would soon adorn Christian vessels and manuscripts. When Patrick explained the Trinity using a three-leaf shamrock, he spoke in symbols his audience already understood. But Patrick didn't work alone. Other missionaries, including Palladius and perhaps figures now lost to history, also spread the new faith. Within a generation, Christianity had taken root across Ireland, remarkable for happening almost entirely without martyrdom or violent resistance. The Druids, seeing their influence wane, gradually faded from Irish society, their oral traditions fragmenting into folklore. What emerged was unlike Christianity anywhere else in Europe. Ireland had no cities where bishops could establish cathedrals. Instead, Irish Christianity became monastic, centered on isolated communities of monks and nuns who combined prayer with scholarship. In 444, St. Brigid founded a double monastery at Kildare, housing both monks and nuns. In 545, Chiron established Clonmacnoise on the banks of the River Shannon, which would become one of Ireland's greatest centers of learning. These monasteries transformed the Irish landscape. At Glendalough, meaning Valley of Two Lakes, Kevin established a community that would eventually house thousands. Monks lived in small stone beehive huts, rising before dawn for prayer, spending their days copying manuscripts, tending gardens, and studying both scripture and classical texts. The round towers they built, soaring over 100 feet high, served as bell towers and refuges during raids, their distinctive conical caps becoming iconic symbols of Irish Christianity. As Rome fell and Germanic tribes swept across Europe, learning itself seemed endangered. Libraries burned. Schools closed. The classical knowledge that had sustained Mediterranean civilization for centuries faced extinction. But in Ireland's remote monasteries, monks painstakingly copied not only Christian texts, but also works by Virgil, Aristotle, and other pagan authors. They studied Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. They calculated Easter dates using complex mathematics. While much of Europe descended into illiteracy, Ireland became a beacon of scholarship. The Book of Kells, though created later around 800, exemplifies this golden age. Its pages explode with color and intricate detail, spirals within spirals, animals transformed into letters, entire universes contained in single decorated initials. Creating one page might take weeks. These weren't mere books. They were prayers rendered visible, sacred objects that demonstrated how completely the Irish had made Christianity their own. Irish monks felt called to share their faith beyond their island. Columbus sailed to Iona in 563, establishing a monastery that would evangelize Scotland. Columbanus traveled to France, Switzerland, and Italy, founding monasteries and challenging corruption wherever he found it. Dozens more spread across Europe, establishing centers of learning from the Rhine to the Alps. Europe's Dark Ages proved to be Ireland's brightest moment when Irish monks, carrying their distinctive traditions of learning and devotion, helped keep civilization's flame alive. By the late 8th century, Ireland's reputation for sanctity and scholarship was unmatched. Pilgrims journeyed to its monasteries, kings sought its monks as advisors. The island that had never known Roman rule, that had no cities or centralized government, had become Europe's intellectual powerhouse. But Ireland's coastal monasteries, wealthy with gold chalices, jeweled book covers, and church treasures, were about to attract a very different kind of visitor across the northern seas. The Vikings were coming. The longships appeared without warning on a June morning in 795. Sleek vessels with dragon prows cut through the waves toward Lambay Island off Dublin's coast. Irish monks, accustomed to greeting pilgrims and travelers, had no context for what approached. Within hours, the monastery lay in ruins, its treasures stolen, its monks murdered or enslaved. The Viking Age in Ireland had begun. These Norse raiders struck with terrifying efficiency. Rathlin Island fell in 795. Inishmurray in 807. In 824, Vikings plundered Skellig Michael, somehow scaling the sheer cliffs to reach the monastery perched 600 feet above the Atlantic. No coastal settlement felt safe. Monks who had copied manuscripts in peaceful contemplation now watched the horizon with dread, knowing that a smudge of sail could mean death was approaching. The Vikings targeted monasteries for practical reasons. These communities held concentrated wealth: gold and silver vessels, jeweled book covers, bronze bells. More valuable still were the monks themselves, who fetched high prices in slave markets from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. The raiders cared nothing for the spiritual significance of what they destroyed. To them, Irish monasteries were simply undefended treasure houses. But the Vikings were more than mere pirates. In 841, they established a permanent settlement at a black pool where the River Pottle met the Liffey. The Irish called it Dublin. This wasn't a temporary raiding camp, but a genuine town, complete with houses, workshops, and defensive earthworks. For the first time in its history, Ireland had an urban center in the European sense. Dublin transformed Irish society in unexpected ways. The Norse brought commercial practices unknown to the Irish: standardized weights, silver coinage, organized marketplaces. Irish kings, initially united in opposition to the invaders, soon recognized the advantages of controlling these new trading centers. Waterford emerged in 914. Limerick followed in 922. Cork and Wexford grew from Norse settlements. Each became a nexus where Irish agricultural goods met Scandinavian trade networks stretching from Iceland to Constantinople. Warfare evolved into something more complex than simple raids. Irish kings began hiring Viking warriors as mercenaries. Norse jarls married Irish princesses. Children of these unions, the Norse Gaelic, belonged to both worlds. Brian Boru's mother was likely Norse. Sigtryg Silkbeard, king of Dublin, married Brian's daughter. These weren't cultural betrayals, but practical adaptations. Ireland was becoming something new, neither purely Celtic nor Norse, but a hybrid society. The archaeological evidence reveals surprising integration. Norse craftsmen in Dublin adopted Irish artistic styles. Irish metalworkers learned Norse techniques. Silver hoards buried across Ireland contain both Irish brooches and Viking arm rings. Language itself merged. Irish borrowed Norse words for ship parts, trade goods, and urban concepts, while Norse settlers adopted Irish naming patterns and legal customs. By 980, the Viking Age's raw violence had transformed into uneasy coexistence. The Norse still held their coastal towns, but they were no longer foreigners. They converted to Christianity, learned Irish, and competed for power using Irish political methods. Dublin had become Ireland's largest city and a major European trading port. Ireland would never again be only an island of monasteries and rural kingdoms. The Vikings had dragged it, violently and irreversibly, into the medieval European world. Yet this integration created new instabilities. Multiple power centers now competed: traditional Irish kingdoms, Norse-controlled towns, and hybrid Norse-Irish dynasties. Ireland's political landscape had grown more complex and more volatile. The stage was set for a king who would attempt something unprecedented, uniting all these fractious elements under a single crown. That king came from an unexpected place. The Dalkai were a minor tribe from Clare, dismissed by greater kingdoms as backwater nobodies. But in 976, a young warrior named Brian changed everything. When his older brother Mathcamain, king of Munster, was murdered by rivals, Brian didn't mourn, he retaliated. Within 2 years, he had avenged his brother and seized the throne himself. He was 35 years old, battle-hardened, and possessed of a singular vision: one Ireland, one king, one crown. Brian understood power differently than his contemporaries. Traditional Irish kings ruled through kinship and tribute, accepting a loose hierarchy where lesser kings paid homage but maintained independence. Brian wanted more. He wanted absolute authority. He began systematically conquering Munster's sub-kingdoms, not as overlord but as direct ruler. Churches that supported him received patronage and protection. Those that resisted found their monasteries occupied by his warriors. It was ruthless, effective, and utterly unprecedented. By 999, Munster was his. Now he turned north toward Meath, where Maelsecnail ruled as High King, a title that carried prestige but limited practical power. Brian didn't challenge Maelsecnail through traditional means. Instead, he launched a calculated campaign of military pressure combined with political maneuvering. He allied with Leinster's king. He courted the Norse of Dublin, offering them trade advantages. He presented himself as Ireland's protector against both external threats and internal chaos. When Maelsecnail finally submitted in 1002, Brian became High King without fighting a decisive battle. He had simply made resistance pointless. But Brian's vision required more than submission. He wanted transformation. He commissioned the Book of Armagh, which styled him Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish. He rebuilt monasteries destroyed by Vikings. He standardized laws across his territories. He encouraged trade between Norse towns and Irish kingdoms. For perhaps the first time, Ireland functioned as something approaching a unified state rather than a collection of feuding tribes. Yet unity bred resentment. Leinster's king Maelmorda, feeling insufficiently honored at Brian's court, rebelled in 1013. He allied with Sigtryg Silkbeard of Dublin, who, despite being Brian's son-in-law, saw opportunity in chaos. They sent envoys across the Norse world, offering plunder and glory. Warriors came from the Orkney Islands, from the Isle of Man, from as far as Iceland. This would be more than a rebellion. It would be a war for Ireland's future. The armies met on Good Friday, April 23, 1014, at Clontarf, just north of Dublin. Brian, now 73, commanded from his tent while his son Murchad led the Irish forces, The Vikings formed their shield wall along the coast, trapping themselves between Brian's army and the sea. What followed was slaughter. For a full day, men hacked at each other with swords and axes. Murked cut through the Viking lines like a scythe through wheat. By afternoon, the Norse broke and fled toward their ships, drowning in the rising tide or cut down in retreat. Brian had won the greatest victory of his life. And then, in his tent, protected only by a handful of guards, a fleeing Viking named Birdir burst through. Perhaps seeking revenge, perhaps simply desperate, Birdir struck Brian down. The High King died even as his enemies routed. Murked too lay dead on the battlefield. The victory was total and completely hollow. Without Brian, the unity shattered immediately. His surviving sons fought over succession. Provincial kings reasserted independence. The Norse towns returned to their old. Within a generation, Ireland looked much as it had before Brian's rise: fragmented, competitive, ungovernable. Yet Brian had proven something crucial. He had shown that Ireland could be united, that one king could command from Cork to Donegal. The dream had lived briefly before dying with its dreamer. But dreams, once proven possible, never completely fade. For over a century after Brian Boru's death, Ireland reverted to its familiar pattern of competing kingdoms and shifting alliances. But in 1166, one of those routine power struggles set in motion events that would permanently alter the island's fate. Diarmait Mac Murchada, King of Leinster, made too many enemies. He abducted the wife of a rival king, burned churches, and antagonized nearly every major power in Ireland. When Ruaidhri Ua Conchobar, the High King, finally moved against him, Diarmait's support evaporated. By 1166, he was in exile, fleeing across the Irish Sea with a handful of followers. Most deposed Irish kings simply waited for political winds to shift. Diarmait went to France and knelt before the most powerful man in Western Europe. Henry II, King of England, Duke of Normandy, ruler of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry gave Diarmait permission to recruit warriors from his territories, a decision he would later regret making so casually. What seemed like authorization for a small mercenary expedition became the legal foundation for English involvement in Ireland that would last 8 centuries. In South Wales, Diarmait found hungry Norman knights eager for land and glory. These were second sons, minor nobles, men who had carved kingdoms from English soil after 1066 and now sought new frontiers. The most formidable was Richard de Clare, called Strongbow, Earl of Pembroke. Diarmait offered him something irresistible: marriage to his daughter Eoife and succession to the Kingdom of Leinster. For Strongbow, whose estates in Wales were modest, Ireland represented opportunity. For Ireland, it represented catastrophe. The first Normans landed at Banno Bay in 1169. They came in small numbers, perhaps 600 men, but they brought revolutionary military technology. Norman knights fought from horseback, encased in chainmail, wielding lances and swords. They built wooden castles that could be erected in days. They used crossbows and advanced siege techniques. Irish warriors, still fighting largely on foot with axes and javelins, had never encountered anything like this mobile, armored force. Waterford fell in 1170 after a brief siege. The Normans stormed its walls, slaughtered defenders, and established their first permanent foothold. Months later, Strongbow himself arrived with a larger force and joined Diarmait in besieging Dublin. The city's Norse-Irish defenders, led by Hasculf mac Torquail, prepared for a long siege. They didn't get one. Norman troops found a weak point in the walls, forced entry, and took the city in a single day's fighting. Diarmait now controlled Leinster again, but increasingly it was Strongbow's army that held real power. When Diarmait died in 1171, Strongbow claimed the kingdom. Suddenly Henry II paid attention. He had authorized a mercenary expedition, not the creation of an independent Norman kingdom in Ireland that might rival his own power. In 1171, Henry crossed the Irish Sea with a massive force, 400 ships carrying thousands of soldiers. He didn't come to conquer Ireland. He came to assert control over Strongbow and the other Norman adventurers. The Irish kings, recognizing the greater threat, submitted to Henry with barely a fight. At Cashel and Dublin, one king after another knelt and accepted him as overlord. They calculated that a distant English king was preferable to aggressive Norman knights seizing land directly. They were catastrophically wrong. Henry accepted their submission, confirmed Strongbow's holdings but under royal authority, and established English administrative structures in Dublin and the surrounding territory called the Pale. The Treaty of Windsor in 1175 between Henry and Ruaidrí, the High King, theoretically divided Ireland. Ruaidrí would rule kingdoms outside Norman control, acknowledging Henry's ultimate authority. The reality was far messier. Norman knights continued expanding their territories, building stone castles, introducing feudal law. Irish kings found their power circumscribed by foreign nobles who answered to a king across the sea. The Lordship of Ireland was born, a hybrid entity neither fully conquered nor fully independent. The Norman knights who arrived as conquerors transformed into something unexpected. Within 2 generations, these warriors who had stormed Waterford's walls were speaking Irish, marrying into Gaelic families and adopting native customs. They built magnificent stone castles across the landscape, over 400 fortifications rising from Irish soil by the mid-13th century. Trim Castle in Meath, Carrickfergus in Ulster, Cahir in Tipperary. Massive stone monuments to Norman power. Yet inside these forbidding walls, Norman lords increasingly lived like Irish kings. The new arrivals established a feudal system foreign to Gaelic Ireland. Land was held through complex networks of loyalty and obligation. Knights owed military service to barons, barons to earls, earls to the English crown. They built manorial estates with villages clustered around castle walls, introducing 3-field crop rotation and heavy plows. Towns expanded as centers of trade and administration. Kilkenny, Drogheda, Galway grew wealthy on commerce flowing between Ireland and England. Norman Ireland, at first glance, appeared a successful colonial venture. But distance and reality worked against English authority. Dublin was weeks from London by rough sea voyage. Royal officials sent from England found Irish lords remarkably difficult to control. The great Norman families, the Fitzgeralds of Kildare, the Butlers of Ormond, the Burkes of Connaught, became powers unto themselves. They intermarried with Gaelic nobility, adopted Irish laws of succession, employed Irish bards to celebrate their deeds. Why shouldn't they? These families were building dynasties, and Gaelic culture was sophisticated, ancient, deeply rooted. Then came disaster from an unexpected quarter. In 1315, Edward Bruce, brother of Scotland's victorious King Robert, landed in Ulster with 6,000 Scottish warriors. Irish kings, seeing opportunity to break Norman power, rallied to his banner. Bruce was crowned High King of Ireland at Dundalk, and for 3 years the island descended into devastating warfare. Norman settlements burned, crops were destroyed, trade collapsed. Bruce's Scottish-Irish army ravaged the countryside, but they offered no alternative government, no lasting solution. When Bruce fell in battle at Falkirk in 1318, he left Ireland economically ruined. Recovery was impossible. In 1348, rats aboard ships from continental Europe brought something more deadly than any army: bubonic plague. The Black Death hit Norman towns hardest, killing perhaps a third of the colonist population. Drogheda, Kilkenny, Cork suffered catastrophic losses. Gaelic areas, more rural and dispersed, weathered the plague better. The demographic balance shifted permanently. English settlers abandoned outlying areas, retreating toward Dublin and the prosperous coastal towns. By the late 14th century, English authority barely extended beyond a coastal strip around Dublin called the Pale, perhaps 30 miles deep. Beyond it, Norman lords ruled as effectively independent princes, while Gaelic chieftains reclaimed vast territories. Desperate to reverse this erosion, the English Parliament in Dublin enacted the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366. These laws attempted to freeze cultural integration, forbidding colonists from speaking Irish, wearing the Irish clothing, playing Irish games, or marrying into Gaelic families. The statutes were comprehensive, detailed, and largely ignored. The reality on the ground made such laws absurd. The Earl of Desmond employed Irish poets, spoke Irish fluently, governed by Gaelic custom. The Burkes of Connaught were indistinguishable from Irish lords except in name. Even within the Pale, Irish language and customs seeped through every barrier. English officials complained that the colony was becoming Irish rather than Ireland becoming English. By 1494, when the next significant royal intervention occurred, English authority in Ireland had shrunk to a tiny coastal enclave. The lordship existed in theory, but in practice Ireland was a patchwork of competing powers: Gaelic, Norman Irish, and a tiny English presence clinging to Dublin. The conquest that had begun with such confidence 3 centuries earlier had produced not an English Ireland, but something far more complicated. The island had absorbed its conquerors as it would absorb so many others to come. The Tudor monarchs who seized the English throne in 1485 viewed Ireland through new, calculating eyes. This was no longer a distant lordship to be casually neglected. Under Henry VII, and especially his son Henry VIII, Ireland became a strategic concern, a backdoor through which foreign enemies might strike at England. The age of benign neglect was ending. In 1494, Sir Edward Poynings arrived in Dublin with a clear mandate: restore royal control. The Parliament he convened that December passed legislation so significant it would dominate Irish politics for centuries. Poynings' law decreed that the Irish Parliament could meet only with the English king's permission and could pass only laws he had previously approved. With one stroke, Ireland's limited autonomy vanished. Every statute, every session required approval from London. The great Anglo-Irish lords who had ruled as virtual kings found themselves suddenly subordinate. But the real transformation began with Henry VIII's break from Rome. When the English king declared himself supreme head of the church in 1534, he expected Ireland to follow. The Irish Parliament obediently passed similar legislation in 1536. Yet religious reformation in Ireland faced obstacles unknown in England. The monasteries Henry dissolved weren't just religious houses. They were centers of Gaelic learning, repositories of Irish manuscripts, patrons of poets and scholars. When royal commissioners arrived to inventory monastic wealth at Mellifont, Holy Cross, and hundreds of smaller houses, they were dismantling centuries of Irish cultural life. Henry attempted subtlety alongside force. His surrender and regrant policy offered Gaelic chiefs a bargain. Surrender your lands to the crown, accept an English title, and receive your territory back as a royal grant under English law. Con O'Neill, the powerful Ulster chief, became Earl of Tyrone in 1542. Other lords followed, accepting earldoms and English customs of primogeniture that fundamentally undermined Gaelic succession practices. On parchment, Ireland was being Anglicized. In practice, many chiefs treated their new titles as additions to their power rather than replacements for it. Elizabeth's reign brought these tensions to crisis. In Ulster, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, spent years playing a double game. Educated in England, fluent in English politics, he appeared the model of the assimilated Gaelic lord. But O'Neill was building something dangerous, a trained army equipped with modern weapons, capable of challenging English forces on equal terms. In 1594, he launched open rebellion. The 9 Years' War devastated Ireland. O'Neill proved a brilliant commander, destroying English armies at Yellow Ford in 1598, where over 2,000 English soldiers died in a single August afternoon. Spanish troops landed at Kinsale in 1601, making this a European conflict. Elizabeth poured resources into Ireland. Over £2 million, astronomical sums that nearly bankrupted her treasury. Thousands of English soldiers died, not from Irish pikes but from disease, starvation, and the brutal Irish winter. O'Neill finally submitted in 1603, days after Elizabeth's death. The new king, James, treated him with surprising leniency. But the old Gaelic world was dying. In 1607, O'Neill and nearly 100 Ulster chiefs boarded ships at Rathmullen, sailing for Catholic Europe in the flight of the Earls. They left behind their lands, their people, their ancient authority. The departure of these lords created a vacuum. Ulster's vast estate stood vacant, its social structure shattered. English administrators surveyed these territories with satisfaction. Here was opportunity. Empty land waiting for Protestant settlers who would transform Ireland into a truly English kingdom. The Plantation of Ulster was about to begin. Ulster in 1609 presented crown officials with what they considered a blank canvas. Over 3.5 million acres of the most fertile land in Ireland lay forfeited, the former territories of O'Neill, O'Donnell, and the departed earls. King James I and his advisors conceived an ambitious social engineering project. They would create an English and Scottish Protestant colony in the heart of Gaelic Catholic Ulster, transforming Ireland's most rebellious province into a loyal, productive territory that might finally civilize the entire island. The plantation scheme divided confiscated lands among 3 categories of settler. English and Scottish undertakers received the largest grants, up to 2,000 acres, on condition they brought Protestant families from Britain to work the land. These undertakers were forbidden from leasing to native Irish. Servitors, English soldiers and officials who had served the crown in Ireland, received smaller parkations and could employ Irish tenants. Finally, some land went to deserving Irish, the few loyal natives who had sided with the crown during the 9 Years' War. From Scotland's lowlands, Presbyterian farmers arrived by the thousands. These were not aristocrats, but hardworking families seeking better lives. Weavers, laborers, small farmers fleeing poverty and religious persecution. They sailed across the narrow sea from Ayr and Glasgow, carrying tools, seed, and an iron determination to succeed. By 1620, over 8,000 Scottish settlers had established themselves in Ulster. By 1640, perhaps 40,000 Scots called Ulster home. The plantation transformed Ulster's landscape. Where scattered Gaelic settlements once stood, planned towns emerged. Derry, renamed Londonderry after the London Guilds funded its development, rose behind massive defensive walls completed in 1618. These fortifications spoke volumes about settler anxieties, walls 30 feet thick, built to withstand siege. Belfast grew from a small castle into a thriving port. Coleraine, Enniskillen, and Armagh expanded under new Protestant populations. These towns featured market squares, Protestant churches, and English-style buildings utterly unlike traditional Irish settlements. But the plantation's orderly vision collided with messy reality. Despite regulations forbidding it, many undertakers found employing native Irish labor economically irresistible. Irish tenants knew the land, understood local conditions, and worked for lower wages than imported Scottish or English laborers. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Protestant landlords and merchants in the towns, Catholic Irish laboring in the fields. Segregation became geography. For dispossessed Irish Catholics, the plantation meant catastrophe. Families who had farmed the same lands for generations found themselves driven to marginal territories. Boggy ground, mountain slopes, rocky soil that barely supported subsistence. Their former estates now housed Scottish Presbyterian farmers who spoke a different language, practiced a different religion, and viewed the Irish with mixture of fear and contempt. Irish landowners who had possessed legal title for centuries discovered that English law recognized only English grants. Their ancient claims meant nothing. Resentment festered through Ulster's Catholic population. They watched Protestant settlers prosper on stolen land while they scraped livings from territory their ancestors would have considered worthless. Protestant churches rose where Celtic crosses once stood. English became the language of courts, commerce, and power. The Gaelic world wasn't just defeated. It was being systematically erased, replaced by an alien society that viewed native Irish as, at best, a source of cheap labor and, at worst, a constant threat. By 1641, Ulster contained two populations occupying the same landscape but living in separate worlds. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and nursed deep mutual suspicion. The powder keg was packed. It needed only a spark. The spark came on October 23, 1641. In Ulster, Catholic Irish leaders launched a coordinated uprising designed to seize key fortifications before Protestant settlers could organize defenses. Sir Phelim O'Neill, claiming dubious authority from King Charles I, led rebels who captured Charlemont Fort within hours. Across Ulster, similar attacks unfolded simultaneously. The rebellion's architects initially sought limited goals: recovering confiscated lands, securing religious toleration, demonstrating loyalty to the English crown while opposing Protestant exploitation. Violence, however, quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Dispossessed Catholics descended upon isolated Protestant settlements. Families were driven from homes into winter cold, wearing only night clothes. Some settlers drowned crossing swollen rivers during forced marches. Others died from exposure in open fields. At Portadown Bridge, rebels allegedly murdered approximately 100 Protestant prisoners, throwing them into the freezing river Bann. Reports, many exaggerated or fabricated, flooded into Dublin describing wholesale massacres. Protestant propagandists claimed tens of thousands murdered. Modern historians estimate between 4,000 and 12,000 Protestants died, mostly from exposure and hardship rather than direct violence. Yet atrocities occurred on all sides. When Protestant forces regained initiative, they showed equal brutality. Scottish Covenanter armies arriving in Ulster burned Catholic villages systematically. Lagan forces in Donegal killed indiscriminately. The conflict rapidly devolved into sectarian warfare where religion determined who lived and who died. Survivors carried trauma that would poison communal relations for generations. By spring 1642, rebellion had spread beyond Ulster. Old English Catholics in the Pale, initially horrified by Ulster violence, recognized their own vulnerability. If the Crown crushed this uprising, would Protestant extremists then target all Catholics, regardless of loyalty or English ancestry? These wealthy, educated Catholics, lawyers, merchants, landowners who considered themselves more English than Irish, made a fateful decision. They joined the rebellion. In Kilkenny, Catholic Ireland organized itself. The Confederate Catholics of Ireland, as they styled themselves, established what amounted to a parallel government. They created a Supreme Council, raised armies, collected taxes, and minted coins. Confederate assemblies met in Kilkenny's medieval buildings, where lawyers debated constitutional arrangements while generals planned campaigns. The Confederates insisted on their loyalty to King Charles. They were fighting against Protestant extremists and corrupt officials, not against legitimate royal authority. Into this complex situation arrived Giovanni Battista Rinuccini in October 1645. Pope Innocent X's nuncio brought money, weapons, and uncompromising religious objectives. Rinuccini envisioned Ireland as a Catholic nation, purified of Protestant heresy. He clashed immediately with pragmatic Confederate leaders willing to negotiate with Protestant royalists. Rinuccini demanded nothing less than complete restoration of Catholic religious supremacy. All Protestant churches returned to Catholic control. All anti-Catholic laws abolished, Protestant worship banned. Meanwhile, England descended into its own civil war. King Charles against Parliament. Royalist against Roundhead. Ireland's Catholics saw opportunity in England's distraction. Perhaps they could negotiate favorable terms with a desperate king needing Irish troops against parliamentary forces. But England's conflict also meant competing armies eyed Ireland's strategic importance, its potential soldiers, its symbolic value. Catholic Ireland found itself trapped in deadly games played in London, Edinburgh, and Rome. By 1649, Ireland had endured 8 years of brutal warfare. The countryside lay devastated. Entire regions depended on plundered food to survive. Disease spread through armies and civilian populations. And across the Irish Sea, a new power was rising. Oliver Cromwell's battle-hardened New Model Army. Ireland's suffering was far from over. On August 15, 1649, Oliver Cromwell stepped onto Irish soil at Ringsend near Dublin. Behind him sailed 35 ships carrying 12,000 veterans of England's Civil War, hardened soldiers who had destroyed the king's armies at Naseby and Preston. Cromwell came not as negotiator but as divine instrument. He believed God had chosen him to punish Irish Catholics for the 1641 massacres, real and imagined. Protestant England demanded vengeance, and Cromwell intended to deliver it with overwhelming force. His first target was Drogheda, a fortified town on the River Boyne held by royalist forces under Sir Arthur Aston. On September 10th, Cromwell's artillery began battering medieval walls. For 2 days, cannonballs pounded stone defenses until breaches opened. When defenders rejected surrender terms, Cromwell unleashed his new model army. The assault was ferocious. Parliamentary soldiers poured through gaps in walls, meeting desperate resistance in narrow streets. What followed shocked even by 17th century standards. Cromwell ordered no quarter, no mercy for any bearing arms. His troops methodically slaughtered the garrison. Soldiers hiding in Peter's Church were burned alive when parliamentarians set the wooden steeple ablaze. Aston himself was beaten to death with his own wooden leg, which attackers believed concealed gold coins. Between 2,000 and 4,000 died in Drogheda. Cromwell justified this massacre as righteous judgment. "I am persuaded," he wrote afterward, "that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood." At Wexford in October, similar horror unfolded. During surrender negotiations, parliamentary troops broke into the town prematurely. Cromwell lost control of his soldiers, who massacred defenders and civilians indiscriminately. Perhaps 1,500 died, including women seeking refuge in the marketplace. Bodies choked the harbor. Cromwell again proclaimed divine approval, claiming God's hand guided his vengeful sword against Catholic murderers. These calculated atrocities served strategic purpose beyond religious zealotry. When Cromwell's army approached other fortified towns, garrisons surrendered immediately, terrified of sharing Drogheda's fate. New Ross, Carlow, and Cork opened their gates without resistance. Those who did fight at Clonmel in May 1650 inflicted heavy casualties on parliamentary forces, proving Irish troops could match Cromwell's veterans when properly led. But resistance was ultimately futile against such overwhelming military superiority. By May 1650, Cromwell returned to England, leaving subordinates to complete Ireland's subjugation. The military campaign continued another 3 years. Guerrilla warfare replaced formal battles. Disease killed more than combat. Plague, dysentery, and typhus ravaged armies and civilian populations alike. Modern historians estimate the war and associated famine killed between 15 and 20% of Ireland's population. Some regions suffered worse. Perhaps half of Munster's people perished. Catholic landowners faced systematic destruction of their entire social order. In 1652, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement. This legislative instrument completed what military force began: total dispossession of Catholic landowners. Anyone who participated in the rebellion before November 1642 would forfeit all property. Those who could not prove constant good affection toward Parliament lost substantial portions of their estates. Protestant soldiers received confiscated lands as payment for service. Protestant adventurers who financed the war claimed their bloody dividends. Catholic landowners were offered stark choice: transplantation to Connaught Ireland's poorest province or death. To hell or to Connaught became the bitter phrase summarizing their options. By 1653, thousands of Catholic families marched westward, forced from ancestral lands held for generations. They received barren plots in rocky Connaught, barely sufficient for survival. Behind them, Protestant settlers occupied fertile fields and prosperous estates. In 1641, Catholics owned approximately 60% of Irish land. By 1660, they held barely 8%. The Cromwellian settlement created the template for Protestant ascendancy that would dominate Ireland for 2 centuries. A dispossessed Catholic majority, stripped of land and political power, would simmer with resentment beneath. When King James II fled England in December 1688, abandoning his throne to his Protestant son-in-law William of Orange, Ireland became his last hope. The Catholic monarch sailed to France, then to Ireland in March 1689, landing at Kinsale with French troops and gold. Here, in this dispossessed Catholic island, James found supporters eager to restore their fortunes. His arrival transformed Ireland into the stage where Europe's great powers would settle their dynastic struggles. Protestant Ulster refused to bend. When James's Jacobite army approached Londonderry in April 1689, the city's Protestant apprentice boys slammed the gates shut. No surrender became their defiant cry as 13 young men took control and prepared for siege. For 105 days, 30,000 citizens endured starvation behind medieval walls while James's forces bombarded them. Citizens ate dogs, cats, rats, and boiled leather. Typhoid and dysentery killed thousands more. Relief ships finally broke through wooden barriers blocking the River Foyle in late July, ending what became legendary in Protestant memory, a symbol of resistance against Catholic tyranny. William himself landed at Carrickfergus in June 1690, commanding 36,000 professional soldiers. His army included Dutch Blue Guards, Danish mercenaries, French Huguenots, and Protestant Irish. James commanded 25,000 men, mostly Irish Catholics with limited training and poor equipment. The armies met on July 1st along the River Boyne, 25 miles north of Dublin. The Battle of the Boyne was less decisive military engagement than symbolic turning point. William forded the river at several points, his disciplined troops overwhelming Jacobite positions through superior firepower and training. James's army retreated in reasonable order toward Dublin, having lost perhaps 1,000 men against William's 500 casualties. But James himself fled immediately to Dublin, then to France, abandoning his Irish supporters. "Change kings, and we will fight you again," Irish soldiers allegedly shouted at their departing monarch. Patrick Sarsfield emerged as the Jacobite cause's true champion. This charismatic cavalry commander led fierce resistance through 1691. When William's forces besieged Limerick in August 1690, Sarsfield led a daring night raid that destroyed the Williamite siege train at Ballinedy, forcing William to abandon the campaign temporarily. Limerick's defenders earned breathing space through courage and tactical brilliance. But by October 1691, after the Jacobite defeat at Aughrim, Ireland's bloodiest battle where 7,000 died in 3 hours, further resistance proved impossible. Limerick faced a second siege with no relief possible. Sarsfield negotiated the Treaty of Limerick in October 1691, securing surprisingly generous terms. Catholics who swore loyalty could keep their property. Religious toleration would continue. These promises would be systematically broken. Most dramatically, The treaty permitted Jacobite soldiers to leave Ireland with honor intact. 14,000 men, Ireland's finest military talent, chose exile over submission. They sailed for France in what became known as the Flight of the Wild Geese. These Irish brigades would serve European Catholic powers for generations, fighting in French, Spanish, and Austrian armies. Their descendants became generals, diplomats, and merchants across the continent. Ireland's lost potential serving foreign crowns. Behind them, they left an island conquered once again. Protestant victory was complete. The stage was set for the Penal Laws that would cement Protestant domination and reduce Catholic Ireland to legal non-existence. The Williamite War's legacy would poison Irish politics for centuries, creating the Orange Triumphalism still celebrated each July 12th in Northern Ireland, commemorating William's victory at the Boyne, that symbolic watershed that determined Ireland's fate for generations unborn. The promises made at Limerick dissolved within months of the ink drying. The Irish Parliament, dominated entirely by Protestant landowners, began constructing a legal fortress to ensure their supremacy would never face challenge again. Between 1695 and 1715, they enacted over 30 statutes collectively known as the Penal Laws, a comprehensive system designed not merely to defeat Catholics, but to render them invisible in their own country. The laws attacked Catholic life at every vulnerable point. Catholics could not purchase land. They could not inherit Protestant property. When a Catholic landowner died, his estate must be divided equally among all sons, unless the eldest converted to Protestantism, whereupon he inherited everything. This legal mechanism efficiently fragmented Catholic holdings across generations. By 1778, Catholics owned merely 5% of Irish land, down from 60% at the century start. Education became forbidden territory. Catholic schools were outlawed. Sending children abroad for Catholic education invited massive fines and property seizure. No Catholic could teach or operate a school legally. Catholic clergy faced banishment. Bishops and regular clergy must leave Ireland by May 1st, 1698, or face hanging, drawing, and quartering. Parish priests could remain only after registering with authorities, essentially becoming state-monitored civil servants. The professions closed their doors entirely. Catholics could not practice law, sit in parliament, vote in elections, hold military commissions, or work in municipal government. They could not own horses worth more than £5, preventing them from maintaining cavalry mounts. They could not possess weapons. They faced exclusion from universities, apprenticeships to Protestant masters, and membership in guilds. Yet Catholics comprised 3/4 of Ireland's population. How does one suppress an overwhelming majority? Through terror combined with economic strangulation. Informers received rewards for reporting illegal priests or schools. Protestant neighbors could claim Catholic property through legal technicalities. Mixed marriages required Catholic partners to convert. Catholic orphans must be raised Protestant. Ireland responded with quiet defiance. Hedge schools emerged. Illegal classrooms hidden in barns, ruins, and behind hedgerows where traveling teachers instructed children in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and Irish history. Scholars etched lessons in dirt with sticks, ready to scatter at approaching authorities. Mass rocks became sacred spaces where priests celebrated services on remote hillsides and in secret glens, congregations gathering before dawn to worship beneath open sky. These outdoor altars, often simple stone slabs, dotted the Irish landscape, silent witnesses to faith practiced in defiance of law. The Protestant ascendancy flourished in deliberate contrast. Georgian big houses rose across the countryside, magnificent estates surrounded by parklands where Protestant landlords lived lives of refined leisure. Dublin became Europe's second city, its elegant squares and wide streets rivaling London's grandeur. Trinity College educated Protestant gentlemen. The Irish Parliament in College Green conducted business in architectural splendor, though representing barely 1/10 of the island's population. This was the golden age that Protestants remembered, a stable, prosperous Ireland under firm control. But that prosperity rested on systematic oppression. 3/4 of the population existed as legal nonentities, clinging to land they could never own, practicing faith-driven underground, educating children in ditches. The Penal Laws created two Irelands occupying the same physical space. One, visible, powerful, and Protestant. One, invisible, dispossessed, and Catholic. This division would define Irish politics for centuries. But seeds of change were germinating. Across the Atlantic, American colonists were challenging British authority using arguments about natural rights and representative government. Their revolution would inspire questions that no penal code could permanently silence. The American Revolution sent shockwaves through the Irish establishment. If British colonists could successfully challenge Crown authority, what might prevent Ireland from doing the same? The question terrified Dublin Castle while electrifying a new generation of Irish patriots, both Protestant and Catholic, who began imagining Ireland as something more than a subordinate kingdom. Change arrived first through pragmatism. Britain, fighting rebellious Americans and hostile France, could ill afford Irish unrest. Beginning in 1778, Westminster grudgingly relaxed the Penal Laws. Catholics could now lease land for 999 years, essentially ownership in all but name. They could inherit Protestant property. Catholic schools gained tacit acceptance. These concessions, while limited, cracked the legal edifice that had imprisoned 3/4 of Ireland's population. Protestant patriots saw opportunity. Henry Grattan, a Dublin lawyer with Republican sympathies, led parliamentary campaigns demanding legislative independence from Westminster. Britain's weakness during the American War gave him leverage. In 1782, facing military crisis and Irish threats of non-cooperation, Westminster capitulated. Poyning's Law, which had subjected Irish legislation to English approval since 1494, was repealed. The Irish Parliament gained authority to pass its own laws without British veto. Grattan's Parliament, as it became known, represented genuine Irish self-government, or so it appeared. In reality, this independence remained shallow. Only Protestants could sit in Parliament. Catholics still could not vote. The Lord Lieutenant, appointed by London, retained enormous power. Westminster controlled foreign policy, trade regulations, and military matters. Ireland had gained the appearance of autonomy while remaining firmly under British control. A young Protestant lawyer from County Kildare recognized this hollow victory. Theobald Wolfe Tone believed half measures would never liberate Ireland. True independence required uniting Catholic, Protestant, and dissenter, dissolving religious divisions that Britain exploited to maintain control. In 1791, Tone co-founded the Society of United Irishmen, initially a political debating club that quickly evolved into something more dangerous. The French Revolution provided both inspiration and opportunity. When revolutionary France declared war on Britain in 1793, the United Irishmen saw their chance. They transformed into a secret revolutionary organization, planning armed rebellion with French military assistance. Tone fled to France, pleading for invasion forces to liberate Ireland from British rule. The government responded with brutal repression. Martial law descended on Ulster and Leinster. Troops burned suspected rebel homes, tortured prisoners for information, and executed without trial. The Campaign of Terror, intended to prevent rebellion, instead ensured its eruption. Rebellion exploded in May 1798 before French help arrived. In Wexford, Catholic peasants led by priests overwhelmed garrison towns, establishing a short-lived republic. In Ulster, Presbyterian farmers rose under Henry Joy McCracken. For weeks, pitched battles raged across the countryside. Rebels armed with pikes fought British regulars with cannon and cavalry. The carnage proved horrific. Government forces massacred hundreds on Wexford Bridge, bodies piling in the river below. Rebels burned Protestant families in a barn at Scullabogue. When French troops finally landed in August, a mere 1,000 men reaching Connacht, the rebellion had already collapsed in drowning pools of blood. 30,000 died in 12 weeks. Wolfe Tone, captured in French naval uniform, chose suicide over execution, cutting his throat in prison. The rebellion failed utterly, but it transformed Irish politics forever. Britain concluded that Irish self-government, however limited, posed unacceptable danger. Westminster's solution was radical. In 1801, through bribery, threats, and promises of Catholic emancipation, they forced through the Act of Union. Ireland's parliament voted itself out of existence. The Kingdom of Ireland ceased to exist, absorbed entirely into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Irish legislature that Henry Grattan had fought to liberate now sat empty, its chamber silent. Ireland had lost even the pretense of independence. The next chapter would be written not in Dublin, but in Westminster. The United Kingdom promised Catholic emancipation as the price for union, but Westminster promptly broke its word. King George III declared that granting Catholics full political rights would violate his coronation oath. For decades, Catholics remained excluded from Parliament despite constituting 80% of Ireland's population. They could vote in limited circumstances but could not sit in the House of Commons or hold senior government positions. Into this political vacuum stepped Daniel O'Connell, a Kerry lawyer who would transform Irish politics through sheer force of personality and organizational genius. Born into a Catholic gentry family that had survived the penal laws through cunning and compromise, O'Connell possessed advantages most Irish Catholics lacked: education at Catholic colleges in France, legal training, and family wealth. Yet he never forgot the humiliations his people endured daily. O'Connell rejected violent revolution. The slaughter of 1798 convinced him that Irish blood spilled in rebellion only strengthened British resolve. Instead, he would mobilize the masses through peaceful agitation, creating political pressure impossible to ignore. He founded the Catholic Association in 1823, charging membership of 1 penny per month. The Catholic rent, an amount even the poorest tenant could afford. Parish priests collected subscriptions after Sunday Mass, transforming the church into a political organizing force. Within months, hundreds of thousands joined. O'Connell commanded a disciplined movement spanning the entire island, funded by a steady river of pennies that financed legal challenges, organized protests, and paid political organizers. Britain had never witnessed anything like it. A mass democratic movement decades before democracy itself existed. The crisis arrived in 1828 when a parliamentary seat in County Clare fell vacant. O'Connell announced his candidacy despite Catholics being barred from sitting in Parliament. His opponent was a government minister confident of easy victory. O'Connell transformed the election into a referendum on Catholic rights. Priests led parishioners to polling stations in organized processions. Tenant farmers defied landlord intimidation. O'Connell won by a landslide. Westminster faced an impossible dilemma. O'Connell had been lawfully elected, but could not take his seat. If they denied him entry, they risked mass uprising from his hundreds of thousands of followers. If they admitted him, they destroyed the Protestant constitutional order. Prime Minister Wellington, the general who defeated Napoleon, recognized military reality when he saw it. Wellington calculated that denying O'Connell would require occupying Ireland with the entire British army. In 1829, Wellington forced through the Catholic Relief Act. After 3 centuries, Catholics could finally sit in Parliament, hold public office, and enter the professions freely. Ireland erupted in celebration. O'Connell became the liberator, the man who had freed Catholic Ireland through peaceful means. Yet victory contained poison. Wellington simultaneously raised the voting threshold, eliminating most Catholic voters. Only O'Connell and wealthy Catholics benefited while millions remained voiceless. Undeterred, O'Connell launched his next campaign: repeal of the Union itself. If peaceful agitation won Catholic rights, why not Irish independence? Beginning in 1840, O'Connell organized monster meetings, massive outdoor rallies that drew hundreds of thousands. At Tara, legendary seat of ancient Irish kings, perhaps 750,000 people gathered to demand repeal. Britain would not yield again. When O'Connell scheduled a massive meeting at Clontarf in 1843, the government banned it and positioned troops with artillery. O'Connell, unwilling to risk massacre, canceled the meeting. His momentum shattered. Shortly after, authorities arrested and imprisoned him for sedition. Released months later, O'Connell emerged a broken man. Worse, famine was descending on Ireland. As the potato blight spread in 1845, O'Connell watched helplessly while his people starved. He died in 1847 while traveling to Rome, his dream of repeal unfulfilled as Ireland entered its darkest hour. The potato blight arrived on the wind in September 1845. Phytophthora infestans, a microscopic fungus from North America, found perfect conditions in Ireland's damp climate. Farmers went to bed with healthy fields and woke to blackened stalks oozing putrid decay. Within days, entire harvests rotted into inedible slime. The stench of decomposing potatoes hung over the countryside like a funeral shroud. For decades, Ireland's poor had survived almost entirely on potatoes. A single acre could feed a family of 6 for a year. The Irish consumed 7 to 14 pounds of potatoes per person per day, supplemented by buttermilk and occasionally cabbage. When the crop failed, there was nothing else. Wheat, oats, and cattle filled Irish farms. but these belonged to landlords who exported them to English markets while their tenants starved. The first winter brought hunger. The second brought catastrophe. The blight returned in 1846 with devastating totality, destroying virtually the entire crop. Then it struck again in 1847 and again in 1848. 4 consecutive years of failure transformed hunger into apocalypse. The British government's response oscillated between inadequacy and callousness. Prime Minister Robert Peel initially purchased American corn, but his successor Lord John Russell believed in market forces and refused state intervention. Many British officials embraced the famine as divine providence, a natural correction to Irish overpopulation and Catholic indolence. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official managing relief, declared the famine a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence that would teach the Irish self-reliance. Public works schemes employed starving men to build roads to nowhere, breaking rocks for pennies while merchants shipped food from Irish ports to England. The government established soup kitchens that fed 3 million people daily by summer 1847, then abruptly closed them, declaring Ireland must support itself. Workhouses became charnel houses. These institutions, designed to deter the lazy poor through harsh conditions, overflowed with dying families. People waited outside gates, too weak to stand, hoping for admission. Inside, typhus and dysentery spread through packed dormitories. The dead were buried in mass graves, often without coffins, their bodies piled in pits covered with quicklime. Evictions accelerated the horror. Landlords, unable to collect rent from starving tenants, cleared their estates to make way for grazing cattle. Agents arrived with battering rams and torches, pulling families from cottages and burning the thatch so they could not return. Entire villages vanished. Families huddled in ditches, constructing crude shelters called scalps from branches and turf, waiting to die. Those with any resources fled. Ships departed weekly for America, Canada, and Australia, packed beyond capacity with desperate emigrants. The coffin ships earned their name honestly. Typhus, dysentery, and starvation killed passengers in their thousands during the crossing. Some vessels lost half their passengers before reaching port. The healthy threw corpses overboard daily. Canada's Grosse Isle quarantine station buried 5,000 Irish in mass graves during 1847 alone. The survivors who reached America arrived destitute and diseased, crowding into urban slums from Boston to New York. They faced brutal discrimination. No Irish need apply signs barred them from employment. Yet anything beat staying in Ireland. Letters home describing American abundance, enclosing precious dollars, inspired millions more to follow. By 1852, when healthy potato crops finally returned, Ireland was transformed beyond recognition. The population had collapsed from 8.4 million to 6.6 million. Over 1 million died from starvation and disease. Another 2 million emigrated. The Irish language retreated into isolated Western regions. Entire generations disappeared. The British government shipped enough food from Ireland during the famine years to feed the starving population twice over. This fact burned into Irish memory with volcanic intensity. The famine was not simply a natural disaster, but a political catastrophe enabled by imperial indifference and ideological rigidity. The catastrophe radicalized Irish politics, convincing many that constitutional methods had failed. A new generation, raised on famine stories, would seek justice through revolutionary violence. The famine generation produced unexpected consequences. Among the survivors who fled to America, many never forgave Britain for what they had witnessed. In New York on Patrick's Day 1858, Irish immigrants gathered in secret to form the Irish Republican Brotherhood. These men, hardened by loss and exile, pledged to win Irish independence through armed rebellion. They took their popular name from ancient Irish warriors, the Fenians. The movement spread rapidly on both sides of the Atlantic. In Ireland itself, organizer James Stephens recruited thousands, particularly among laborers and shop assistants. Young men who remembered the famine bodies along the roads now drilled in secret with weapons smuggled from America. The American branch, calling itself Clan na Gael, raised funds and battle-tested veterans from the Civil War. By 1867, the IRB claimed 50,000 members in Ireland alone. The Fenian Rising of 1867 revealed both revolutionary determination and catastrophic planning. On a freezing March night, groups of rebels attacked police barracks and Coast Guard stations across Munster and Leinster. In Dublin, insurgents attempted to seize Chester Castle's arsenal. The British had been tipped off. Arrests came swiftly. Within days, the Rising collapsed, its leaders imprisoned or executed. Yet the Fenians had demonstrated something crucial. A new generation refused to accept British rule as permanent or inevitable. The failure of violent rebellion redirected energy toward economic warfare. Michael Davitt, a Fenian who lost his right arm in a factory accident at age 11, recognized that Ireland's true enemy was the landlord system itself. In 1879, following another partial famine, Davitt founded the Irish National Land League. His strategy was brilliant: organize tenant farmers to refuse rent increases and resist evictions through collective action. The land war transformed rural Ireland into a battlefield. When landlords evicted families, thousands of neighbors appeared to prevent bailiffs from approaching. Communities ostracized anyone who took land from evicted tenants. A Mayo land agent named Charles Boycott found himself so completely shunned that his name entered the English language as a verb. No one would work his fields, sell him food, or deliver his mail. He fled the country. At Westminster, Charles Stewart Parnell emerged as nationalism's parliamentary champion. Elected at age 29, this Protestant landlord's son became an unlikely revolutionary. His obstruction tactics paralyzed British legislation. His alliance with Davitt married agrarian agitation to parliamentary pressure. The British press called him Ireland's uncrowned king. The strategy worked. Prime Minister Gladstone, facing rural insurrection and parliamentary chaos simultaneously, introduced Land Acts beginning in 1881. These laws allowed tenants to appeal rents, protected them from arbitrary eviction, and eventually enabled them to purchase their holdings with government loans. By 1891, when Parnell died aged 45, the landlord system that had dominated Ireland for centuries was crumbling. The land belonged at last to those who worked it. Yet political independence remained elusive. Home Rule bills failed repeatedly in Westminster. The question remained, could Ireland win freedom through votes, or would the Fenian dream of armed revolution ultimately prove necessary? The plan was audacious, perhaps mad. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, While most of Dublin celebrated a spring holiday at the races, approximately 1,600 Irish volunteers and members of the Irish Citizen Army gathered secretly across the city. Their commander, schoolteacher Patrick Pearse, carried a document that would transform Irish history, the Proclamation of the Irish Republic. At noon precisely, the rebels seized the General Post Office on Sackville Street, Dublin's grandest boulevard. Pearse strode to the portico and read the proclamation to bewildered passers-by. "Irishman and Irishwoman," he declared, "in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom." The document bore 7 signatures, men who styled themselves the Provisional Government of the Irish Republic. Few citizens joined them. Most Dubliners considered the rising foolish, even traitorous, with Britain locked in brutal war against Germany. Women shopping on Sackville Street hurried past the GPO, annoyed by the disruption. Some shouted abuse at the rebels. Irish soldiers home on leave from France jeered. How dare these men stab Britain in the back while thousands of Irish volunteers died in Flanders? The rebels seized strategic positions across the city. The Four Courts, Boland's Mill, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, the South Dublin Union. At Dublin Castle, the heart of British administration, a handful of rebels might have captured the Viceroy himself, but inexplicably withdrew. The revolutionaries commanded perhaps 2,000 fighters total, armed with an eclectic mix of weapons, facing 20,000 British troops who could be rapidly reinforced from England. For 6 days, Dublin burned. British gunboat Helga sailed up the Liffey, shelling rebel positions with artillery. Machine guns rattled from rooftops. The GPO's elegant facade crumbled under shell fire. Flames consumed entire streets as incendiary rounds ignited shops and homes. Civilians caught in crossfire died in doorways and cellars. The fighting reduced the city center to rubble, creating an apocalyptic landscape of collapsed buildings and smoking craters. The rebels never stood a military chance. Cut off from each other, running desperately short of ammunition, they watched British reinforcements arrive by the thousands. On April 29th, with the GPO in flames around him, Pearse ordered surrender to prevent further civilian casualties. The 7 signatories of the proclamation, along with rebel commanders from each position, were arrested and marched through Dublin streets. Crowds spat at them. Women whose sons fought in France threw refuse. The Easter Rising appeared a catastrophic failure. Then Britain made a fatal miscalculation. General Sir John Maxwell, given absolute authority over rebels, ordered military courts-martial. Between May 3rd and May 12th, 15 leaders were executed by firing squad in Kilmainham Gaol's Stonebreaker's Yard. James Connolly, so badly wounded he could not stand, was tied to a chair and shot. Patrick Pearse walked to his death calmly, having predicted martyrdom would succeed where rebellion failed. Each execution was announced in morning newspapers, each one turning public opinion more firmly against British rule. Ireland watched in mounting horror. These were not common criminals, but poets, teachers, labor organizers. The public, initially hostile to the rising, began reconsidering. Might these men have died for something noble after all? The very brutality of the executions validated the rebels' claim that British rule meant oppression. John Dillon, an Irish parliamentary leader, warned Westminster, "You are washing out our whole life work in a sea of blood." The transformation was swift and total. By summer, the executed leaders had become martyrs, their words and images reproduced on memorial cards like saints. The rebel flag, green, white, and orange, appeared in windows. Recruiting for the British Army, once vigorous in Ireland, collapsed almost overnight. Britain's empire had crushed the Easter Rising militarily but lost the greater war for Irish hearts. The question now was not whether Ireland would be free, but when and at what cost. A new generation had seen martyrdom transform defeat into moral victory, and they were learning its lessons well. The election of December 1918 delivered a verdict that shook Westminster to its foundations. Sinn Féin, a party barely known 4 years earlier, captured 73 of Ireland's 105 parliamentary seats. The moderate Irish Parliamentary Party, which had dominated Irish politics for decades through patient negotiation, was obliterated, winning just 6 seats. The message was unmistakable. Ireland demanded independence, not home rule. The newly elected Sinn Féin members refused to take their seats in London. Instead, on January 21, 1919, they assembled in Dublin's Mansion House and proclaimed themselves Dáil Éireann, the Parliament of Ireland. They ratified the 1916 proclamation and declared Irish independence absolute. Britain dismissed this as theater, but the same day, Irish volunteers shot 2 Royal Irish Constabulary officers escorting Gelignite in County Tipperary. The War of Independence had begun. Leading the fight was Michael Collins, a charismatic Cork man who had fought in the GPO during Easter week. Just 28 years old, Collins understood something previous generations had missed. Ireland could not defeat Britain in conventional warfare, but it could make occupation unbearable. As Minister for Finance, he organized a national loan that raised over £300,000. As Director of Intelligence, he built a ruthless spy network that infiltrated Dublin Castle itself. Collins' greatest weapon was information. British detectives investigating republicanism found themselves identified, tracked, followed home. Collaborating with the enemy became suicidally dangerous. In the countryside, flying columns of IRA fighters, rarely more than 30 men, ambushed police patrols, seized weapons, and vanished into the hills. Barracks were burned. Tax collectors were driven away. British authority evaporated from vast rural areas. London responded with fury. Unable to recruit enough regular soldiers after the Great War's carnage, Britain deployed the Black and Tans, ex-soldiers named for their mismatched khaki and dark police uniforms. Later came the auxiliaries, hardened war veterans paid £1 a day, enormous wages that attracted the desperate and violent. These forces brought counterinsurgency tactics from the trenches, collective punishment, reprisals, terror. The war spiraled into darkness. When IRA men attacked, entire villages suffered. Creameries were burned. Shops were looted. Homes were torched in midnight raids. Cork city centre was deliberately set ablaze by Crown forces in December 1920, causing £15 million in damage. The beautiful Victorian buildings along Patrick Street became charred shells. Witnesses described drunken auxiliaries preventing fire brigades from approaching. But the defining moment came on November 21st, 1920, a day forever known as Bloody Sunday. At 9 that morning, Collins' squad, his hand-picked assassination unit, simultaneously attacked 14 addresses across Dublin, killing 14 British intelligence officers in their beds or at breakfast. It was surgical, ruthless, devastating. Britain's spy network in Ireland died in a single morning. That afternoon, black and tan surrounded Croke Park during a Gaelic football match between Dublin and Tipperary. They claimed to be searching for gunmen. Instead, they opened fire on the crowd of 5,000 spectators. 14 civilians died, including 3 children. The player's Michael Hogan fell dead on the pitch that now bears his name. Britain claimed the crowd had fired first, a lie no witness supported. The war ground on through 1921, neither side able to achieve decisive victory. Britain could not pacify Ireland despite 50,000 troops and police. The IRA could not drive them out but made their presence intolerable. By summer, both sides were exhausted, bankrupt, desperate for resolution. Prime Minister Lloyd George, facing international condemnation and mounting costs, finally offered negotiations. In July, a truce was declared. The guns fell silent. But could either side accept the compromise that peace would demand? Michael Collins arrived in London in October 1921 as part of a 5-man Irish delegation. At 31, he was Ireland's most wanted man, a guerrilla commander with a 12,000-pound bounty on his head. Now he sat across polished tables from the men who had tried to kill him. The British team, led by Prime Minister Lloyd George, held every advantage: constitutional expertise, imperial resources, and the implicit threat that war would resume if talks failed. The negotiations lasted 2 brutal months. The British position was clear. Ireland could have dominion status, similar to Canada or Australia, but must remain within the empire and swear allegiance to the crown. Northern Ireland, created the previous year with its own parliament in Belfast governing 6 counties with unionist majorities, would remain separate unless it chose otherwise. The boundary would be reviewed by commission. A vague promise that Irish delegates hoped meant substantial territory would transfer south. Collins recognized the impossible position. Total independence would bring immediate war against an enemy Ireland could not defeat. The IRA was nearly out of ammunition, its flying columns exhausted. Yet accepting anything less than a republic would betray everything 1916 had promised, everything 2 years of warfare had cost. At 1 a.m. on December 6th, under threat that Britain would unleash total war within 3 days if they refused, Collins and the others signed. "I have signed my own death warrant," Collins reportedly said, understanding the fury this compromise would unleash at home. The Anglo-Irish Treaty gave 26 counties dominion status as the Irish Free State. Members of its parliament would swear an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. Britain would maintain naval bases on Irish soil. Northern Ireland could opt out, which it immediately did. Ireland would be divided, partitioned into 2 separate entities for the first time in history. The Dáil debated the treaty for weeks in sessions that turned former comrades into enemies. Amon de Valera, the president who had remained in Dublin during negotiations, rejected the treaty as betrayal. Arthur Griffith and Collins defended it as stepping stone toward full independence. The debates grew vicious, personal, bitter. Women deputies who had lost sons and husbands in the struggle wept as they condemned the compromise. On January 7, 1922, the Dáil approved the treaty by 64 votes to 57, a margin of just 7. De Valera resigned and walked out. The IRA split down the middle, with hardliners refusing to accept anything less than the republic they had fought for. The same men who had ambushed British patrols together now eyed each other as traitors. By April, anti-treaty forces occupied the Four Courts in Dublin, Ireland's central judicial building, establishing it as headquarters for their opposition. The new provisional government, desperate to prove itself capable of maintaining order, faced impossible choices. Britain warned that failure to deal with the occupation would void the treaty. On June 22nd, anti-treaty forces kidnapped a Free State general. Collins, now commander-in-chief of the new National Army, borrowed artillery from the British and bombarded the Four Courts. The building that had survived the Rising of 1916 burned as Irishmen killed Irishmen. The Irish Civil War had begun, a conflict that would prove far bloodier and more traumatic than the fight against Britain had ever been. Brother would fight brother in a war without mercy or quarter. The war that Collins predicted would be his end came true on August 22, 1922. Ambushed at Beal-na-Bláth in County Cork by former comrades, he died at 31, a bullet through his head. The Civil War raged for another 9 months, claiming thousands more lives and leaving scars deeper than centuries of British rule ever had. When it finally ended in May 1923, the pro-treaty side had won militarily but lost morally. 77 anti-treaty prisoners had been executed, a legacy of bitterness that would poison Irish politics for generations. Two Irelands now existed on one island. In the north, a unionist government ruled 6 counties with a permanent Protestant majority carefully designed to maintain control. Catholics faced systematic discrimination in housing, employment, and voting rights. The police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was overwhelmingly Protestant and often openly sectarian. Northern Ireland's first Prime Minister, James Craig, declared it a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. The Irish Free State evolved gradually toward full sovereignty. Eamon de Valera, after sitting out politics during the Civil War, returned in 1926 to form a new party, Fianna Fáil. When he came to power in 1932, he systematically dismantled the treaty's restrictions. The Oath of Allegiance was abolished. The British naval bases were reclaimed. In 1937, a new constitution declared Ireland a sovereign nation, though it still remained within the British Commonwealth. When Europe plunged into war in 1939, de Valera declared Ireland neutral, a stance that enraged Britain but demonstrated the independence that had been won. Over 70,000 Irish citizens volunteered to fight for Britain anyway, an awkward reality that the Free State preferred not to acknowledge. On Easter Monday, 1949, exactly 33 years after the Rising, Ireland formally became a republic and left the Commonwealth entirely. The final ties to Britain were severed. But Northern Ireland remained British, and Catholic resentment grew through the 1950s and 60s. In 1968, inspired by civil rights movements elsewhere, Catholics marched peacefully demanding equal rights. They were met with police batons and loyalist mobs. The Royal Ulster Constabulary attacked protesters. Sectarian riots erupted. British troops deployed to Belfast and Derry in August 1969. What began as a civil rights movement descended into the Troubles, 3 decades of bombing, shooting, and murder. The Provisional IRA waged guerrilla war against British forces and targeted Protestant civilians. Loyalist paramilitaries killed Catholics. British soldiers killed protesters on Bloody Sunday in Derry, 1972, when they shot 13 unarmed civilians. Over 3,600 people died, most of them civilians caught between forces that claimed to protect them. The violence finally began to end with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. Power would be shared between Unionists and Nationalists. Ireland renounced territorial claims to the north. The possibility of future unification remained, dependent on democratic choice. Peace was fragile, incomplete, sometimes barely holding. But the guns mostly fell silent, and a generation grew up without war on their streets. Ireland's story spans 10 millennia, yet its themes remain achingly current. Survival against impossible odds. Identity preserved through catastrophe. Memory that refuses to fade. This small island absorbed wave after wave of invasion, genocide, and famine, yet its language still echoes in classrooms, its music fills concert halls worldwide, and its divided communities slowly, painfully, learn to share the same ground. The question Ireland has always asked, who controls our story, remains the question facing nations everywhere today. Subscribe to explore more histories of resistance, resilience, and the long, complex roads to peace that define our modern world.